I'm Kate Stohr. I'm the co-founder of Architecture for Humanity. We provide design services to communities in need. We're a network of about 40,000 architects. And it's my great pleasure to welcome today's panelists onto the stage. I'm first going to welcome Claude Jeudy. He's the National Director of Habitat for Humanity in Haiti. Come on up, Claude. Also today we have Bryan Mauk, who's the Executive Director of Casa. Welcome, Bryan. And finally, Ananya Roy, who's the Education Director at the Blum Center for Developing Economies. Ananya, come on up. Oh, actually, sneak over here. All right. So today we're going to be talking about some of the wide-ranging issues that affect the global housing crisis. And actually, because how many of you live in the United States? Okay. And how many live abroad? Okay. So why don't we start close to home, actually, if that's okay. And Bryan, maybe you could talk a little bit about what you do at Casa. And your role working in homeless and your perspectives on working with homelessness.
Sure. Right now, I'm the executive director of Casa. We're a transitional housing shelter for Hispanic families. A lot of the families that come to us are families who are fleeing domestic abuse. So they're there for a year. And during that time, they meet every week with a case manager to get back and they help on a variety of different things, from dealing with the trauma of their abuse to employment and all those other issues that behind homelessness. And that's really my view on homelessness, that it's really more of a symptom than a problem. There are many underlying issues that contribute to it, and whether that be domestic abuse, mental illness, drug abuse. There's a variety of different issues, but when it boils down to it, homelessness is the symptom of a problem that is in the individual and in the society that we have. And that really, with the foreclosure crisis and the abundance of houses we have in this country, there's really no reason for people to be homeless. It's just there's no excuse. It's just like food in our country. We make enough food to feed the world 4 or 5 times over or something like that, and still people go hungry.
And then, Ananya, I wanted to ask this of you. This is an interesting thing. In the United States, we talk about homelessness, yeah? But in the rest of the world, we don't talk about homelessness. So what is that about? And maybe you could talk a little bit about your work looking at settlements and cities across the Middle East and India.
Well, a lot of my interest in the issues of housing and homelessness have to do with the fact that we are going to live in what is inevitably an urban century, but a century in which much of that urbanization will take place in cities of the global south, where large numbers of people will live outside of formal housing. So while we use the term homelessness quite a bit in North America, in much of the rest of the world, that term is rarely used. It's not that people do not face similar problems with homelessness, but rather that there are a whole range of shelter options that they can utilize, be it pavement dwelling or living in slums or living in squatter settlements. It is not that those forms of housing are a substitute for formal housing, but it shows the ways in which people can be housed outside of formal housing. But it also points to the fact that the housing question is inevitably political, and that there are quite different pathways of housing at work in different parts of the world. So in India, which I'll return to later again in our discussions, we're witnessing an incredible criminalization of urban poverty and a criminalization of informal housing.
What do you mean by that? I'm not
going
to let you go on that one.
Well, by the ways in which the Indian judiciary has declared squatting and quite a bit of slum dwelling to be a crime, quite literally, which has meant that the ways in which people house themselves informally are becoming outside the law, and that there are therefore large-scale evictions and displacements. that is diametrically opposed to what we're seeing in Brazil, where there's a very vibrant right to the city movement, where the urban poor have been able to stake not only rights to shelter, but the right to be in the city, which is different yet again from the Middle East, where, in fact, a whole set of unusual civil society actors, the most unusual of which is perhaps Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is a militia organization, but also a housing provider. These unusual organizations are stepping in and providing housing outside of the formal provision of housing by the state.
And we're going to talk about Hezbollah too, because I think that's a really interesting point. And then Bryan, I want to go back to you though. So we have this issue of homelessness. Is it political here? Is Ananya right?
Yeah. I was thinking as you're saying that about making different slums and outlawing them. That's a thing that's happened just in my hometown and is happening. I've been talking about it all day with a bunch of different people across the country. This idea of it being illegal to sleep outside, in our public parks, under bridges, places like that. That is suddenly this kind of. Because it's visually displeasing to some people, it's become illegal, which is terrible. And I mean that people can't catch a few hours of sleep on a park bench is just it's sad, and that we can make those kind of things illegal is sad.
And in Haiti, we don't call it homelessness there either. What was it like? You've been in Haiti. You started in 2004 with Habitat, right? So before the disaster, how many units of housing was Habitat doing?
Before the disaster, we've been providing 3,000 houses.
A year.
A year.
Yeah. And now after the disaster, after the earthquake, how many units are you
We already
doing?
provide 28,000 solutions to families after the disaster, starting from the emergency shelter kit till upgradable solutions.
And
But the difference between what they've said and what we are doing, we used to be a revolving fund program. That means our focus was serving those who can pay back what we spend for them. That means we serve those who live in inadequate solutions, and we help them to find and to have a decent place to live. It is not a giveaway. Right after the disaster, we had to deal with some homeless people because we work closely with municipalities and civil protection department to address needs of housing, including those who are homeless after disaster.
And so now it's not just a revolving debt program. Are you still doing that?
Our vision stays the same. We need to be a revolving fund because we don't believe in assistance. For us, assistance leads nowhere. We need to conserve the self-esteem, the dignity of people. Because they have lost everything, we understand we need to create a pathway to permanence to them. We give them a solution. When they get back on their feet financially, they will be able to be part of our revolving fund program. What we are doing now is a giveaway, but it's a way to assist them, to accompany them until they get back on their feet financially.
And we've got some sort of very timely topics at hand right now, and I think it's really interesting that we have these three guests here. And so I thought it'd be interesting to talk about three things. We don't have too much time, but three things. One, the foreclosure crisis. And it affects all of you, and I know it does. Two, the sheer number and frequency of disasters and the difficulty of rebuilding after disaster. And then three, I would love to talk about the issue of slum development, slum upgrading, and the connection between that and politics, and particularly in the Middle East, where we've seen so many of these governments toppled in the last few days. And what is the connection between that and secure housing? So that's what I'm hoping we can talk a little bit today. And I thought maybe we'd start with the foreclosure crisis. And you have the best story of the world. And I want you to talk about your work before you went to Casa in Cleveland, and the business model that you were trying to get started, and how you got into that. So Bryan, talk a little bit about that. And you all know the depth of the foreclosure crisis. We don't need to go there, right? Yes? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, what I was doing prior to coming to Casa was I started an organization called the Metanoia Project. And in Cleveland, we got hit really hard by the foreclosure crisis. And we have tons of homeless people. So the general idea was to rehab these abandoned and foreclosed homes and give them away to homeless people. And in the process of rehabbing them, to have job opportunities for homeless people to pick up skills in the construction trade. So it was a really interesting program from the perspective of there was the opportunity was in this terrible foreclosure crisis in this particular area of the city. It was the highest concentration of foreclosures in the entire country. Entire blocks were decimated. They were entirely vacant, almost, for just, there'd be one person left on an entire block and it'd all be empty. So we had the opportunity to focus our efforts on one block or one street, and we started working our way down the street rehabbing houses. So not only were we rehabbing houses, creating jobs, and creating housing for.
Were you buying these houses from the bank?
People were actually giving them to us. Banks were donating them. Families who their parents had passed away were donating to us to them. It was incredible how often my phone rang with people wanting to give away a house, and that kind of ridiculousness was possible because of this tragedy, and so we were able to move down the street, basically just contacting people that owned these houses and saying, hey, you got this financial and legal liability that's sitting here. People are gonna steal plumbing and all that fun stuff. We'd love to take it and explain what we were doing. So then it was rebuilding the neighborhood too, and the people that were moving into the houses all worked on each other's houses. So we were building community and really trying to restore the neighborhood as well as work with the housing issue.
So what happened?
So what happened? Well, we did 3 houses, and we really proved the economic viability of the model, and that's where it was. And we started, we didn't actually just give the house.
You started this when you were in college. You were in college?
Yeah, well, I started it right my senior year, and then I did it through grad school.
I'm just pointing that out for y'all.
Yeah, it was, and so I started it when I graduated from college. I always used to rant about, if I only had the money, this is how I'd fix the problem. And somebody said, oh, why don't you, throw it down on a grant proposal and see what happens. And believe it or not, the darn thing got funded. And I had this moment where it's like, shoot, now I got to actually do all that, which was really kind of scary. So I went back and got my master's degree in nonprofit administration. So it's kind of an interesting learning what I was doing at night and then trying to fake it during the day. But it worked out, and it was really.
Where did the funding come from to rehab the houses, and how much did it cost to rehab a house?
Yeah, each house was done for an average budget of $10,000, and the funding came from a couple of different foundations that started that were willing to take a huge leap with us, and so we had. And then the sustainability model of it was that if we get it up to scale with enough houses, but we didn't actually just completely give the houses away. They were on a rent-to-own basis, but it was pretty much a nominal cost. But that nominal cost could add up to be enough to fund the rehab of future houses and kind of continue it moving forward. So we kind of proved that it worked, and then. And then I had to move away to Chicago for personal reasons.
And is someone carrying up the work?
Yeah. I'm still involved on the board and conference call in a lot. And but the work continues. And they've also been working on a drop-in center, which is another unique idea in Cleveland. It's an overnight place for people who are homeless and living out on the street to come inside. A lot of people who are mentally ill for a variety of reasons don't want to go into shelters. One lady, her name was Leslie, refused to go into a homeless shelter one night when it was like negative 30 degrees out. I'm begging and pleading with her, and she was mentally ill, and she said, I can't go into a homeless shelter because I'm the Queen of Holland, and that would destroy Holland's reputation. So we came up with this idea of a drop-in center, which was a real low threshold place for people to come in and to hang out outside the streets. We had movies playing all night long, pool table open, foosball, all sorts of stuff. And then we had staff from mental health services, rehab, drug rehab people. And it wasn't like they had an office where they engaged people. They engaged people watching movies, playing pool. And when their issues came out in conversation, more on a friend basis, they were like, oh, well, I happen to have a background in mental health services. You want to come aside and we can talk about treatment. And it just completely changes the paradigm. Instead of going through a central intake at a shelter where they say, here's what you need. You need to go to this guy and he's going to help you get clean, and then you got to go to this guy and they're going to give you medicine. This is more of a, our model was more friendship, more personalized, and much more, I think, dignified, if you will. And a lot of the mental health services really said that it was a much more effective way to engage their clients.
Mm. And how has the foreclosure crisis impacted the areas where you guys are working? And we're going to start with Ananya. Are you seeing the impacts of the foreclosure crisis around the world in housing?
Well, I think it's less about the impact of the foreclosure crisis elsewhere as it is that the foreclosure crisis brought attention to at least a couple of things for those of us interested in urban poverty and housing. One of them was that at the heart of the foreclosure crisis was the idea of subprime loans, the ways in which those who have been hitherto excluded from housing finance were included, but included on terms different than those given to normal or prime borrowers. And second, it showed the ways in which finance capital functions in the housing sector, what has been talked about as the financialization of everything, that housing loans had been bundled and securitized and sold and resold, what came to be called slice and dice finance. So that similar issues are playing out elsewhere in the world. I just got back from a conference that we were organizing in Delhi, India, around issues of urbanization and urban planning there. And the director of India's National Housing Bank talked about how one of the greatest challenges of the housing bank has been to provide housing finance to low-income households, because those are seen as inherently risky borrowers, and they don't know how to lend to these low-income households. Well, the ways in which low-income households have traditionally accessed finance is precisely through something like the subprime loan, which can be quite discriminatory, where the terms of the loan are fundamentally different and set families up for the types of foreclosures that we saw here in the US. So there's some really important cautionary notes. Now, I'm also interested in other sorts of financing, including microfinance, and there are all sorts of experiments underway with housing microfinance. But as many of you perhaps know, microfinance runs the risk, the quite real risk of predatory lending, where interest rates can be very high, even though loans are being made to the poor. So the foreclosure crisis, if nothing else, points to a set of cautionary notes that I think apply worldwide.
Claude, Haiti. In Haiti, there is no
we
mortgage
we are not
industry
directly.
even. So, but, is it something we should look at? Is access to finance important? Is home ownership the answer? And I think that's a real question. With so many people renting, it really is home ownership what we should be striving for?
We do have some mortgage bank in Haiti, but the poor people we are serving are not directly served by those banks because they don't have the capacity to become eligible for the criteria those banks establish. However, the consequences of the foreclosure in the US affect Haitian families because, as you know, we have a large diaspora in the US, those who support their relatives in Haiti because they've been struggling to pay their mortgage, and 60% of what they receive from parents living in the US help them to repair and to improve their houses. Because they receive less money than usual, they take more time to improve their situation. We are not directly affected by that, but our families, we depend on what they receive as remittances from the parents in US are directly affected by that. Mm.
And a lot of the funding that's coming for reconstruction in Haiti is coming in the form of loans. Correct. Do you think that this is a path that's going to be effective?
I think we need to avoid any free assistance, any solution that can incorporate participation in the community, not only in terms of sweat equity, in terms of financial participation. Loan should be the best way to give access to houses to people. Now, what kind of loans are we talking about? What kind of interest rate are we talking about? But I believe housing microfinance should be a good tool to give access to many people today in Haiti who don't have access to houses. I support loan as a tool to get access to houses.
So I'm kind of interested in this because you got these foreclosed houses, right? And then you gave them back to the homeless people on a rent-to-own basis. Rent-to-own. Why did you choose that structure? And what does it say? I mean, I'm genuinely asking this question. Is home ownership really the path to security for most people in the world? I'm genuinely asking that.
Yeah, in retrospect, it was far wiser than I thought it was. At least the way it worked out. The original reason to do rent to own was it was simple on the paperwork.
Okay, well, all right.
But practically, as things started to play out, the way we continued with it was we found that there is a big difference between renting a house and owning a house. And a lot of the people, there's a lot of challenges to being a homeowner. You have to maintain your house. If something breaks, you have to know how to fix it, and be able to afford to pay to fix it. Home ownership, or home insurance. There's a lot of all these other things that they don't teach you about when you're in school or anywhere that you just kind of have to pick up. So that was one of the real strengths to starting with the rent-to-own basis. People could have 2 or 3 years to figure out how to fix things, to learn that when things would break and we'd come over and fix it for them, we'd show them how to fix it, how much it cost, and so that way they were prepared for this idea of home ownership before.
How long would it take to own if you were in your structure?
3 to 5 years. It's kind of we say 3 years, and then when they pay it off in 5, then we're happy. So if they make half the payments over 3 years, we get them in 5, or over 5 years, So.
Ananya?
I think
You're smiling over there. That's why I'm turning to you.
I think the question about home ownership is a really important one, because home ownership as an ideal didn't just fall out of the sky. It was constructed through policy. So those of you who were in my office hours earlier today have heard me say this, but in my classes I often talk about how I live in public housing. And what I mean by that is that I live in a home that I own with my partner, and the tax deductions we receive on our homeowner mortgage is the real public housing policy in America. We have subsidized and nurtured home ownership, not only through these tax deductions, but through subsidizing highways and all sorts of things. We have not put similar effort into social housing or into rental housing, that renters do not receive the same subsidies. So when we talk about home ownership as a dominant ideal in North America, well, it's not surprising because as a society, we have chosen to make it an ideal. And I think the foreclosure crisis calls that into question. Now, I should also point out that that idea, an ideal of home ownership, is not global. There are all sorts of other ways in which housing can be provided. Singapore, which has invested quite heavily in public housing, such that 95% of the country lives in public housing, but can also buy and sell public housing, is a quite different model. And I think thinking about those alternatives can be quite crucial. In the American case, at least, it is that emphasis on home ownership that then sets up that quite exclusionary notion of homelessness. That if you don't own a home here, then it's almost as if you're not a citizen. You can't vote, you don't have political rights. One can almost talk about American citizenship as being propertied citizenship. That if you don't own a home, you're no longer a citizen. That is a very particular political configuration that I would argue needs to be rethought and challenged.
I'm not sure that you mean ownership, but if you don't have a home.
Well, because I'm arguing that the options of renting are so limited, particularly in large metropolitan areas. And since as a society we do not subsidize rental housing,
Right.
that in fact if you don't own a home and if you're not on that pathway to owning a home, your options remain quite limited, and therefore often one is stuck with that choice of owning a home or not.
Claude, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, sure. Own a house in Haiti is not only an ideal. Culturally, the most important asset a citizen of Haiti can have is a decent place to live. If we go back on the provinces, you don't have the right to ask to a father the hands of her daughter or his daughter if you don't have a decent place, a home. That means for every Haitian, the renting option is for those who don't have any way to build their own place. So anyone who's living in the provinces and the rural area, before asking the hands of a lady to get married with her, the first thing he does is building his own place. That means ownership, home ownership in Haiti is very important. That's why we are trying to put everyone in contact with a system that can help them to build their place, because for any Haitian, when they rent a place, they are looking forward to living this place and build their own property.
And people live in the same home for most of their lives.
Yeah, and when we cannot have enough food today, enough clear water to drink, but we really give importance and crucial importance to a home, personal home we have.
So, and it's funny that you should bring that up, because Ananya and I were talking about the link between, a sense of prosperity and having a home, and how that unfolded in the Middle East. And maybe Ananya could talk a little bit about that, especially in Egypt.
Well, as all of you have perhaps been watching, there's been quite a social revolution that's unfolded in the Middle East and North Africa, particularly in Egypt. And I've been doing research in Egypt for a few years now. And I think that social revolution is not surprising, because what has been taking place in Egypt since the early 1980s has been a hollowing out of the economy, where young men and women, your age, with college degrees, have been unable to find meaningful employment. And that lack of employment has meant that they've also been unable to gain access to the housing market, to find a foothold in the city. Many of them have continued living with their parents. In Egypt, young men, and it is young men, are almost required socially to be able to provide an apartment, usually an apartment that is owned, not rented, furnished, to offer to their bride-to-be before they can get married. And it has been impossible to do so without any meaningful employment. So in fact, we've seen a social paralysis leading in fact to the kind of social revolution that we've seen in Egypt, which has called into question these social conditions. Now, whether or not the future will bring meaningful employment, access to housing, job security for this young generation remains to be seen. But it's quite clear that a generation frustrated with being unable to imagine a future for themselves took to the streets in quite an inspiring way. And I think the housing question was a key part of that. I should clarify that I use this term housing question, and I borrow that term from the 19th century, actually. I don't know if any of you have read Frederick Engels' very famous Housing Question, written about the mills of Manchester. And he argued that the housing question of the 19th century was whether or not industrial workers would be able to afford decent housing. I think the housing question in the 21st century is possibly quite different, but we're still struggling with the housing question.
We're going to probably come back to the housing question. We have 6 minutes. Let's talk about disaster reconstruction. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what's going on in Haiti right now and what you view as the major impediment to rebuilding in Haiti.
I have to contextualize the situation of Haiti. The housing problem didn't start with the earthquake. Before the earthquake, we've been dealing with a housing deficit quantitatively of 1 million. And 75% of existing homes in Haiti need to be repaired before the earthquake. The situation we are struggling with today become worse because 200,000 families have lost their homes. But when it comes to build houses after disaster in a country where the infrastructure doesn't exist, no road, even you bring crushers, backhoe loader to clean the debris, to remove the rubble, you don't have road to go and take out the rubbles. And the land issues is a problem. As I mentioned this morning, if you invite Asian people to bring the title, the dimension of Haiti is 28,000 square kilometers. Don't be surprised if you receive title for the size of America. That means for one piece of property, you can receive 1,000 titles. So when it comes to build in a country like that, you need to articulate really creative, innovative solutions. Because if you wait until you clear the title, until you have secure land, no one will be able to move to a decent place. What we are doing in Habitat, we say, okay, let's be creative. Let's articulate some kind of solutions that can help people to have a decent place to live. That's what we decided to provide, what we call emergency shelter kit, some tools families can use immediately to protect themselves against rainy seasons, against even any possible disaster. We do also provide some transitional shelters. Why we have chosen to provide transitional shelters? Because a piece of land doesn't have any owner when it's empty. When you start putting something in it, a lot of owners come up. So we say, okay, while we are providing the transitional shelters, if some ownership problems occurs, the beneficiaries can just remove all the materials and place them somewhere else. For those who have clear title, we provide what we call the upgradable shelters, a concrete solid foundation with a combination of concrete blocks and plywood, and they can upgrade the shelters over time. Because as you understand, they have lost everything. They don't have the means to build a permanent solution. We are accompanying them to have some decent place to live while they are improving the economic situation, and over time they can expand what we provide to them. But land and debris are the best challenge, the biggest challenges we are dealing with in disaster.
And the government of Haiti is using eminent domain. And that comes up after every disaster, you know, no matter whether you're working in Katrina or you're working in Pakistan, eminent domain comes up. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the government has been using eminent domain, what your thoughts are on that. Your land was subject to eminent domain, if I recall. Your land, no? Did you not have eminent domain at one point, Claude, on your land?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, talk a little bit.
As you know, Port-au-Prince has been severely affected after disaster. The best way to address the problems post-disaster is not only to build back Port-au-Prince, is to build back better Port-au-Prince. And the government decided to declare eminent domain 7 hectares of land in the North Pole of Port-au-Prince.
And also the downtown.
Yeah. But declare eminent domain is one thing, but there are a lot of steps to take after that. you need to pay the real owners of the land. Where the government is going to find money to pay, even they decide to pay less than the market price, they need to have money to do that. Unfortunately, the land has been declared public utility, but anything else has been done with the real donors of those land. So they are there, and a bunch of citizens establish their camp and think, I have the right to live on this land because this land has been declared eminent domain. And the real owners are trying to execute their own projects on those lands. And now there is a confrontation between the squatters and the real owners.
And Ananya, this is almost the definition of some of the work you've been doing in slums and looking at slums and how slums are caused, no?
Well, I think the interesting issue here, to build on some of the points that Claude has made, is that we tend to think about a very sharp division between what is formal and informal. And in working with informal settlements, for a long time the established wisdom was that one should go in and, in a fight for social justice, simply formalize these informal settlements by providing formal or regular land titles. And what we're learning from all of these experiences, be it Haiti or India, is that what really matters is to think about what may provide security of tenure and how can that be achieved. In the communities I have been studying, it's quite clear that providing formal land titles would make many poor communities much more vulnerable because they would not be able to pay for, to make the payments for those regular land titles. They would not be able to pay for the regular services that are provided. They would not be able to make those monthly payments. And that, in fact, a certain amount of informality may, in fact, provide for security of tenure. So thinking about these quite interesting gradations of tenure and thinking about how we, as planners and architects, can use informality to help the poor remains, I think, an important lesson beyond the formal-informal divide.
And I think we're going to see a lot of gray title in Cleveland, I'm guessing. All right, so we're going to stop now, and we're going to move into a question-answer period. However, one of the most important things about doing housing work, and something that we at Architecture for Humanity work on every day, and I know each of these people does, is trying to attract capital to make investments in housing that will significantly improve the lives of the poor. And so today, I have $40 million, okay? And I want each of you to tell me a project that I should invest my $40 million at. And each of you are going to be able to ask them questions about that project, and we're going to have a quick evaluation as to whether or not which project we should invest in. Yeah? You clear? Okay. Yeah. They're going to tell us. They're going to tell us. Yeah. Okay, I've got $40 million. Bryan, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I guess I can pitch the organization at Noya for $40 million. You know, as we said, we average about 10,000 a house. We'll add a couple bells and whistles onto it for $40 million. We could throw solar panels on the roof to make them electrically sustainable, and you know, for another 15 or another 5 for installation. So for 25 a house, we can completely rehab a home, and we could do it all in one neighborhood in Cleveland. And I could do the math, but it kind of hurts of how many units we could do with 40 million. 1,000 maybe? Sound good? So 1,000 homes in Cleveland we could rehab. At the same time, we'll be creating jobs, training a new workforce in green home development, and as well as you know, creating affordable housing, home ownership, building home ownership, decreasing homelessness, and building communities and rebuilding neighborhoods that have been destroyed by.
Right. Go ahead, Claude. $40 million. How are we going to rebuild?
Yeah, first thing I will do, because the government doesn't have the capacity to pay back the real owners, I will take part of this money to pay some land and to secure some land. I don't believe in giving away program. I will create a model of village with 150 families. It will be a pilot to be duplicated along the way. And not only 150 houses will be built in that village, I will also bring some livelihood components. Chicken farms, for example, that can give a monthly salary to each family in that village that will help them to pay back what we invest for them. I will provide them the basic services like healthcare, education, clean water, and I will attract commercial investment. By doing that, once I succeed, I will duplicate this model in several areas in the country. And a lot of multilateral donors, bilateral donors will come because I will succeed with that project.
Thank you, Claude. Ananya.
So I'm going to go against the grain here a bit and say that my project is located in India, where I've been doing research for quite a while, but $40 million would not necessarily make a dent in India's housing crisis. Because in the largest metropolitan cities, let alone in all of the other cities in India, between 50 to 60% of the urban population are not only poor, but housed under quite vulnerable conditions. So rather than a few discrete projects, my suggestion would be to spend the $40 million on what I would call the Urban Majority Project, to dramatically change the ways in which Indian policymakers and the Indian law views the urban majority, which is in fact the urban poor living in India. It would be to create a massive advocacy organization that would in fact reverse the laws that currently criminalize squatting and slum dwelling. It would be to call into question also the many types of informal urban developments that have been launched by the rich in India. So much of the suburban developments in cities like Delhi and Calcutta are homes, gated communities of the wealthy, and they're actually as illegal and informal as squatter settlements and slums, except that they have come to be tolerated and even celebrated. There's very little attention to these settlements. So in fact, this is about a right to the city movement that would be funded by the $40 million, and you would not be able to recoup financially the $40 million,
okay.
but hopefully it would change the terms of the housing crisis in India.
All right, we've got the urban majority. We've got the model village in Haiti, and we're going to rehab houses and create green jobs in Cleveland. Questions for these three about these projects? In the back, in the white shirt.
Hello. Actually, I'm very interested in the urban homes in India and the urban policies in India. My commitment being in that space. The worry I have most is something I think that was demonstrated in a lot of the projects that were created in the United States, specifically Chicago. What will you be able to do about the organized crime that currently controls and actually owns, I guess, a lot of the social situation in many of the slums? How will you engage them? Will you be able to engage them? Will you be able to create security in those social systems that currently exist? Or is the advocacy only going to extend as far as policy making and hope that the crime lords will not be able to continue their...
So the question is your advocacy progress going to address syndicated crime effectively?
That's a good question. One of the challenges in the Indian context is precisely the ways in which land mafias control large swaths of land, both in elite neighborhoods and in poor neighborhoods. And I think part of this has to do with the lack of vibrant social movements that in fact have created alternative political spaces for addressing the housing question. And here, once again, I'm quite inspired by what has happened in Brazil, where democratization and the creation of a new constitution in the 1980s put the housing question at the heart of social movements. And there were cross-class alliances that created quite specific statutes giving people the right to inhabit the city that involved not only the work of the urban poor, but also the work of progressive lawyers, the work of progressive architects and planners. So the idea is precisely to create...
Where can we learn about that in Brazil?
So one can Google Right to the City. One can also look up the work of my colleague at Berkeley, James Holston, who has a beautiful book.
I know pimping.
A beautiful book called Insurgent Citizenship,
Lovely.
which is a lovely idea to think about precisely what I'm suggesting for India.
Next question. In the back again? Did I miss anyone? Oh, there we go. Someone waving in the white shirt there, and then we've got a question in the back. And we'll try and keep it quick.
Hi, my question is to the, I'm sorry, what was your name again? The urban housing project in
Claude?
India?
My name is Ananya.
Nadia, hi, sorry. My concern really rests with the affordability of housing for the people that would be benefiting from your project. Because I'm from New York City, and we have a lot of housing projects there in all 5 of the boroughs. And over time, there was a lot of good intention, but over time, the housing just degraded because there were lower class families who really couldn't afford to be there, and it became like a big forgotten project. So there was a large sum of money invested into making those projects, but then over time, it just kind of degraded itself somehow. So my concern is for the affordability. Like, how would these families sustain that type of living? Because I see you're really improving their status of living. So how would they sustain that status if we're not really concentrating on them working and their
I think
income?
the question is long-term maintenance and sustainability of
Right.
the housing projects you're developing. And all 3 of you should answer that anyway. So go ahead, Bryan.
Long-term maintenance and sustainability? Yeah, I think it would be, the long-term maintenance would be, of course, making sure that people would be paying off their houses and the community stays strong, and making sure that as we rebuild the tax base, the government funding and programs, the schools, all that other infrastructure that's been destroyed with the Cleveland, the east side of Cleveland becoming a ghost town, would be rebuilt and.
But where are the long-term jobs coming from?
Yeah, that's why I threw in the solar panels concept. To bring we're going to do solar panels on the whole east side of Cleveland. We're going to need a solar power plant, to make the panels and start the green revolution.
The Green Revolution is going to be in Cleveland.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and the same question in Haiti. I mean, and this is actually a very serious question in Haiti: is how do families afford the housing that you provide with?
Sometimes we make people eligible for a solution they cannot afford. That's why I am promoting a solution that can be very holistic and integrated. If you place a house in the middle of nothing, we are not resolving problems. We are creating more problems. So I'm promoting a solution with a component of livelihood that can help people generate incomes to do the maintenance and to continue their life. So I am not for a solution that can please to the eyes of others without giving the quality of life human being deserves. So in Haiti, we are targeting not the poorest of the poor, but a class of people that can afford the solution, and we encourage them to build incrementally. Today we can address the floor, let's do it. We can address tomorrow the roof, let's do it. Even we take 5 years, but we don't diminish the quality of life of families by providing them a solution.
Incremental housing near livelihoods.
Correct.
Yeah. Ananya.
Note that I'm not saying necessarily that we have to build public housing in a place like India. I'm saying we have to take one step back and ask a more fundamental question, which is, can we design and plan our cities to take account of what is the urban majority of the 21st century, which is the urban poor in these cities, which means rethinking even our professions. And once we take account of the urban majority, housing options may be everything from slum upgrading to social housing. But I think your question also raises the connection between shelter and livelihood. And in the Indian case, if we don't take account of the urban majority, it means that the urban poor, the 50 to 60% of cities, are being pushed further and further to the peripheries, where it's impossible for them to find the meaningful urban jobs that they once had. So the right to shelter is one of the most important ways in which we can combat the peripheralization of the poor in the cities of the Global South.
Other questions? We have probably time for 2 more, maybe.
Hello? Right here, I'm in the center.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right.
So hard to see here, I'm sorry.
My question is for Mr. Jeudy. To your previous comments, overpopulation and decentralization is a major issue in Haiti, like in many other developing countries in the world, but especially in Haiti, since its capital, Port-au-Prince, was designed to maintain a population of 500,000, but pre-earthquake had about 2.5 million. So my question, would Habitat for Humanity, with your proposed pilot village, be housed in a more rural area where it's environmentally more stable as opposed to the near or closer to current city centers? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. My point of view, the rebuilding of Haiti or of Port-au-Prince needs to start in the provinces. The best way to keep people from coming from provinces to Port-au-Prince is to build the provinces. As you know, Port-au-Prince has been built for 250,000 in 1749. Before the earthquake, we had 4 million people in this city. According to sphere ratio, a citizen needs 3.5 square meters to live. Today, each Haitian is living in 1.98 square meter. So the project I'm talking about will be in the provinces. It will be a pilot, and I will duplicate it in as many provinces as possible. Creating the livelihood will keep people attached to their own communities. They don't have to come to Port-au-Prince to find a paradise. Lack of economic activities push people to leave the provinces, to come to Port-au-Prince, and they create the slum area, which is a tool for politicians, which is a tool for many, many other people. So I'm promoting a displacement of activities to the provinces in order to decentralize activities, create income activities in the provinces, and Port-au-Prince will become, or Haiti will become, the paradise it used to be before the independence.
And you think that'll create more political stability?
Correct, because politicians are taking advantage of the misery and the poverty instead of improving the situation.
And the concentration of people.
Correct.
Last question. In that corner, waving your hand. You've been really waving.
This question is for Mr. Claude, and it's regarding Haiti, obviously. My question is specifically about Habitat for Humanity. First of all, how does Habitat for Humanity choose the families they are receiving these emergency shelters? Second of all, who builds these shelters? Third of all, after the families receive this emergency shelter, what would be the next step after the emergency shelter? Because if we talk about poverty alleviation, yes, you could give a family an emergency shelter, but that's just gonna make poverty in a nicer house. What does Habitat for Humanity do to keep on helping these families for them to become sustainable?
You have 3 questions. First one, how do we
Actually,
choose?
I'm going to ask you two to also answer. How do you select the people that benefit from your program? But you go ahead.
Yeah. As you know, we cannot be everywhere in the same time. When we intervene in a community, we work closely with municipalities and the civil protection department, which is the equivalent of FEMA in US. So they have a copybook, a register, where they have the name of all affected families. So we select our beneficiaries based on the list that the municipality and the civil protection department have. By doing that, we avoid overlapping and duplication. And who built those transitional shelters? We use local laborers because, as you know, they've lost everything. We need to strengthen the community to boost the economy. We use the local laborers because they don't have some techniques. We bring some engineers that can teach them how to build seismic resilient construction. So the local laborers build the tea shelters. And at the end, what is the plan? To continue the assistance we are giving to them. We are articulating 3 responses: the emergency shelter kits, the transitional shelters, and the upgradable shelter. We give them those solutions while they are improving their financial situation. As I mentioned, we connect them with microfinance institutions that can help them generating activities. And because they generate income, they will be able to become eligible for a loan to repair the floors, a loan to repair the walls, whatever they need to do, so that the way Habitat for Humanity is going to continue helping those families.
And it's interesting, too, all over the world, and Architecture Humanities worked in, 7, 8, 9 post-disaster environments. You think that people want their housing built back first, but that's actually not the case. If you're really working in these communities, the first thing they ask is their livelihoods. They will live in a tent for how long it takes, but they need their livelihoods back. And so when we rebuild, we often spend our first time and our first portion of our funding on things like schools, small businesses, that sort of thing. Because once you have that in place, you can rebuild your housing. But that's I digress. You chose 3 families. How did you choose your families, and how would you choose them for your program?
Yeah, I think on the small scale, and as much to try to keep that with it, what we did was we really took a personal aspect of picking our families. There are people who both were ready for home ownership, or at least could be ready within a reasonable amount of time, could hold a job that could pay for the house, and long after they owned it, and finally had no other options. Didn't have. For whatever reason, they fell through the cracks. So those were our 3 criteria, if you will. And to take that to scale, I think the important part would be keeping that personal approach to this, because it's such a great opportunity, and it is kind of a lending thing, and especially with the subprime thing and how it got so unpersonal, I think was really why it all kind of came crashing down. It became so they bundled everything, they took all the people out of it, and there weren't even homes left into it. It was just numbers on the stock exchange. And as soon as we forgot that there were people and actual tangible things out there, it got corrupt.
It used to be you got a mortgage from your local banker who knew you. But now a mortgage could be sold 6 times in its history. You don't know who has your mortgage.
Yeah, and people who own the mortgage don't even know who they own or what they own, because it's been rebundled and packaged. So returning
and
to that
the
local...
The robo-dialing, right?
Yeah.
I don't, if you've been following the robo-dialing was one of the issues because families didn't have anyone they could talk to. They were informed that they were being foreclosed on by an automated voice message system, right? So, I mean, those kinds of issues, when you take it personal, you can actually improve the outcome.
Yeah, and and then also if people are struggling with the payments, to be personal and to understand.
So I think that in thinking about the housing crisis, we need to think not only about how the poor are served, but we also need to think about the wealthy and the propertied in our cities. So in India, one of the big challenges is that there hasn't been the political will or the government capacity to enact meaningful property taxes. And if there were a system of property taxation for the parts of the city where land titles are very well known, then one could generate quite massive amounts of resources that could be directed in all sorts of ways to addressing the housing question. And that sort of focus, I think, is quite important for those of us interested in the relationship between housing and poverty alleviation.
And I'll leave it on that. I think that's so interesting that you bring it back to that, because the housing question is also a question of economics, of politics, of all the things that go on in a community impact housing and the distribution of housing. So thank you very much, our 3 panelists, for joining us today and talking about your viewpoints and the particular issues that you are addressing and how timely they are. Yeah.